Dr. Litman, as you may know, began his practice in remote areas in Canada, and about 10 years ago, he and his wife moved to Israel, and he has many specialties, and today he's going to be talking to us about integrative cancer treatment. One fun fact you might not know about Dr. Litman is that he once played the violin as a young man, and then he said he took pity on his friends and family and stopped playing. So please welcome to the stage Dr. Mel Litman.
Okay, so what I want to do today is go through the scientific evidence base for integrative cancer. Most often, when my patients go to their oncologist, and they say they want to try some other integrative treatments, the standard response is, there's no evidence. There's no evidence, and because there's no evidence, you shouldn't do it. Or sometimes even worse, they'll say, well, don't do it while we're doing our treatments because it's going to interfere with our treatments. So what I want to do is to spend the next hour or so going through this evidence that doesn't exist. So you may be familiar with some of the statistics already, just in terms of the status of cancer now. We've been watching it steadily increasing. Since 1900, there's been a steady increase in cancer, both in adults and in children. It's also interesting because in the past it was often said that, well, it's actually a good thing that we're seeing more cancer because cancer happens in old people, and because we're living longer, that's why we have more cancer. It's not true. In fact, what we're often seeing now, when I graduated in medicine, if we saw a 25-year-old woman with a breast lump, it wouldn't even occur to us that that could be a cancer. It would be so rare. If I see them now, the first thing you're going to think of is cancer, because the age of cancer has been coming down and down. So there's been a definite increase. For these statistics they were showing, it's increasing every year, 1.6% in women, 1.5% in men, and that really hasn't changed. It's still continuing, in the same curve. This was just an interesting study looking at breast cancer incidence in Chinese women. So they saw Chinese women living in China had a 40 to 60 per 100,000 incidence, except when they moved to San Francisco, it came up about 3 times as much. So it's very clearly showing that the increase is largely environmental. It wasn't that that these women suddenly acquired the breast cancer gene when they moved to the States. It was being the cancer was being promoted by the change in the lifestyle. This was kind of an interesting paper. It's an old one, but this one was done not by oncologists. It was actually done by a statistician, and he was a very sort of bottom line kind of guy. He was just looking at the incidence of cancer and the death rate from cancer. So he wasn't concerned about whether there were partial remissions and whether there was complete response and incomplete response, and he was just looking at the bottom line: are they alive or dead? And when he was doing this, he saw that that there was a steady increase in both the incidence and mortality in cancer. He did another follow-up paper 11 years later showing that it was continuing the same way. It's interesting too here is that there were some declines in cancers, and they found that there were a couple of them in cancer of the cervix and the colon, and in lung cancer. In lung cancer, that was mainly because they were poisoning themselves less with less smoking. In cervix and colon, it was interesting because those are maybe our only couple of cancers where we have a test to detect them before they become cancer. So we have the pap smears, we have colonoscopies to look for polyps. So this is not early detection. Early detection in terms of finding a cancer when it's small, in order to increase the cure rates, hasn't turned out to work so well. You're finding even when you catch the cancer small, once it's cancer, it didn't seem to change much the mortality rates. But if you're able to catch it before it becomes cancer and deal with it then you can actually have some effect. This was another infamous study done by some Australian oncologists. And here they were looking at, they called the contribution of cytotoxic chemotherapy to 5-year survival in adult malignancies. So what they did is they reviewed all the clinical trials they were available to them, reporting 5-year survival, attributed to chemotherapy. And they looked at 22 adult malignancies, both in the US and Australia. And this is a quote from their conclusion. The overall contribution of curative and adjuvant cytotoxic chemotherapy to 5-year survival in adults was estimated to be 2.3% in Australia and 2.1% in the US. It's clear that cytotoxic chemotherapy only makes a minor contribution to cancer survival. And in fact, even a lot of that minor in survival increase was in 2 or 3 specific cancers. Most of the major ones, they really didn't see much change in terms of 5-year survival. This is just some epidemiological studies. So here they looked at a large population in Europe, and all they measured were vitamin B6, folate, or the amino acid methionine. And if they had high levels of these, of any one of them, they could have a 50% or greater reduction in lung cancer. And even better if all of them were good. So this is showing the preventive benefits of nutrients. But whenever you see a study showing the benefits of nutrients, you get one of these studies. You may remember this one. It's called Dietary Supplements and Mortality Rate in Older Women. So they did a study, and the conclusion of the study, and this was headlines that went out all over the world, said multivitamins increase deaths in older women. It's a very dramatic headline. Women and other people all over the world immediately stopped taking all their multivitamins. Based on this, they figured, the next one was going to get them. So when they dissected it, though, and you looked at some of the statistics inside of it, they said, well, if they were taking B complex, they had a 7% decrease. If they had vitamin C, they had a 4% decrease. If they had vitamin D, they had an 8% decrease in mortality. So if you had all these vitamins decreasing it, how do you get this conclusion that multivitamins are going to increase mortality in a specific group? Now, fortunately, the Europeans, a year later, did another large study. This one they call Vitamin Mineral Supplementation in Cancer, Cardiovascular, and All-Cause Mortality in a German prospective cohort. So here they had almost 24,000 people in the study. They followed them for 11 years. And what they found is that people who were using antioxidant vitamins right from the beginning of the study had almost half the mortality risk, half the cancer mortality, and 42% less of all-cause mortality. So here we're seeing a pretty dramatic reduction in mortality in this study with people taking antioxidants. But they did isolate one particular group within it. They said non-users at baseline. So at the start of the study, there were people not taking supplements, but they started it at some point. And in that particular group, they said we found that there was an increased risk of cancer and mortality. So how do you explain that? And the way they mostly explained it is what they called the sick user effect. So people who had started the supplements during the study, they started them for a reason. And they started them because they were already sick. They were diagnosed with some serious illness, and as part of their treatment, they started taking some supplements. So it wasn't that the supplements increased their mortality, it was that their disease increased their taking the supplements. But when you're doing these associations, they don't show up unless you look for it. And it looked like this is really the same thing that occurred in the other study. This is the latest one of these, the latest nutritional study looking at lung cancer risk. And here when they pulled apart their statistics, they said individuals taking vitamin B12 and B6 had an increased risk of lung cancer, but not if those same vitamins were part of a multivitamin. Now, I went through this paper pretty carefully, and what you couldn't find in there was any of this, stratification for the sick user effect. So they didn't show at all, when people started taking them, if they had the same issue of sick people starting on the vitamins. So we didn't have any of that information. There was also no blood levels done. So we don't know what their B12 level was before or after they started taking them. Some of the problems with this that makes it very confusing is that people often take B12 because they have a B12 deficiency. Normally you're not going to take it as a separate vitamin unless there was some issue about it. And usually if somebody's B12 deficient, unless they're a vegan, it's usually because they're not absorbing. And most of the time, when they take their B12 supplement, they're still deficient. So again, this could be very misleading because it could very well be that this increased risk was because of an ongoing vitamin deficiency rather than the supplement, causing the risk. But it's impossible to be able to sort that out from the information they provide. But still, the message that goes out to the world is that, B12, B6 is going to give you lung cancer. This one was actually a randomized controlled trial, a large one, and it was done with doctors. They had, 14,600 male physicians, 50 years or older, and they followed them for a long time, 11 years, and they randomized them either to placebo or to a multivitamin. The multivitamin they gave, by the way, was a one-a-day RDA synthetic, multivitamin. It wasn't, one that you would necessarily want to use, but that's what they used for the study. But even with that, they said there was a statistically significant reduction of about 8% in total cancer incidence in the men taking the multivitamin. So even with a poor quality, low dose multivitamin, it still had an effect on reducing cancer incidence. When some of the feedback came in from the medical profession, a lot of it had to do with, well, that's not so great. It's only 8%, that's not so impressive. But they were really missing the point. I mean, the thing is that they shouldn't have had any reduction based on the assumptions being that this is a healthy group of patients. Presumably the doctors are living an even healthier lifestyle, following all the guidelines from the government. So in theory, they shouldn't have had any effect at all. And the fact that it was from a very low dose vitamin, and we'll see as we go a little bit later, if they were using substantial doses in proper combinations, the likelihood is it would have been a much more dramatic change in the incidence. Here's just another, this is a treatment one. So this is bladder cancer patients who had their surgery, they had their treatment for their bladder cancer, and then they were either given a low-dose multivitamin or they added fairly substantial doses of vitamin A, B6, vitamin C, vitamin E, and zinc. And then they looked at what happened 10 months later. They said if you took the RDA supplement, you had an 80% chance of relapsing. If you added some high-dose supplements into the mix, it cut it in half. So this again, showing that it's not just taking some vitamins. You need the doses and you need the combinations. Just some information on vitamin D in cancer. This was a review study based mostly on observational studies and one randomized trial. And their conclusion is the expected effect of raising year-round vitamin D to 40 to 60 reduced case fatality rate of patients with breast, colorectal, prostate cancer by half. So getting the vitamin D levels up to better ranges, reduces some of the most common cancers by half. Now, what do you need to get to that range? Because the recommendation is to take 600 units a day. In order to get to the 40 to 60 range, most people are needing about 4,000 to 5,000 units a day. So again, you need to take enough in order to get the benefits. This was just kind of an interesting paper where they were looking at the issue of spontaneous regression of cancer. So they're saying, well, there's people, they have cancer, but it just disappears. It just goes away by itself. So here they went to look for them. They found 200 people who reported spontaneous regression of cancer, and they questioned them. And what they found is that 87% made major dietary changes, 65% were using nutritional supplements, 55% were using some form of detoxification. So it seems that the spontaneous regression, takes some pretty major efforts for it to just go away. Okay, and these are some studies with prevention. So this is antioxidants in breast cancer. Here they had, they were following 10 years of women with breast cancer compared to women to controls, and they were looking at their supplementation. So they found breast cancer in premenopausal women was reduced by 54% by taking a zinc supplement. And in postmenopausal women, it was reduced 26% with a multivitamin, 42% with beta-carotene, 21% with vitamin C, 25% with vitamin E, and the winner again was zinc with a 53% reduction. And this one is a study of women with breast cancer. And here they're looking at the survival in women who already are diagnosed with breast cancer. They're all getting conventional treatments. But the women who were using vitamin E, vitamin C, or multivitamins had an 18% reduced risk of death and 22% decreased risk of recurrence. So here we're looking at the vitamins for prevention and also for survival. This is a similar one, again looking at breast cancer. And here they had women who had taken multivitamins and minerals before they were diagnosed with breast cancer. They were already on supplements. And they continued it through their whole course of treatment, were 31% less likely to have a recurrence, 47% less likely to die of their breast cancer, and 27% less likely to die of any cause. If they only took vitamins without the minerals, they didn't get the same benefit, and that would make sense when we looked at how important things like zinc were in terms of the cancer prevention. This is something more recent, looking at neoadjuvant chemotherapy. This is, something that's becoming fairly routine now, is that women with breast cancer, they diagnosed with a lump. Before they do the surgery, they give them chemotherapy. The idea is to shrink it and then to have less surgery that needs to be done. But what they're finding here is by giving the chemotherapy, especially they were looking at a few specific drugs, paclitaxel, doxorubicin, cyclophosphamide, they showed an increase in what they call TMEM scores, which are scores that are reflecting the risk of the cancer spreading. So by doing the chemotherapy before the surgery, it looks like it was actually increasing the chance that they were going to spread the cancer. There is some similar work being done right now with that fits into the same thing with stem cells, with cancer stem cells. This is another, sort of popular direction right now, the idea that cancers have their own stem cells. And the stem cells are the dangerous ones. Those are the ones that will spread, that will seed out in other parts of the body, and the ones that are not killed by chemotherapy and radiation. So these are the dangerous ones. And they found, that when they were looking at breast cancer, they said, a lot of lumps, if they took them out, they found 2 or 3% of the cells were stem cells, so these dangerous ones. If they did this neoadjuvant chemotherapy before, and then they took the lump out, they found that they shrunk the tumor. It did get smaller, most cases, but they greatly increased the numbers of stem cells. So again, things looked better superficially, but we may actually have been making the situation worse. Another controversial area is the area of hormones and breast cancer. And it mostly started with a study in 2001, the Women's Health Initiative, where they showed women on HRT, which they defined as Premarin and Provera, that was HRT, showed that the women who were taking the hormones compared to the placebo had a 26% increased risk of breast cancer. They also had increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, blood clots. But they were using these two specific hormones. What went out to the world, of course, was not that maybe you shouldn't be taking these hormones. What went out to the world was hormones are going to give you breast cancer. There was no differentiation one kind or another. Hormones are going to give you breast cancer. And again, millions of women stopped. But in the paper itself, there was this interesting comment that says, it remains possible that transdermal estradiol with progesterone, which more closely mimics the normal physiology and metabolism of endogenous sex hormones, may provide a different risk-benefit profile. They already had a pretty good idea. If they were using different hormones, they probably would have got different results. But that's not the message that went out to the doctors or the public. 10 years later, the Women's Health Initiative was still going on, and they did another analysis of a subsection. So there was a group of women who were only on Premarin, only on the estrogen, and not the Provera, the progestin. Usually this is because the progestin was only added to protect the uterus from the harmful effects of the estrogen. So they added, so if a woman had a hysterectomy, then she didn't need to be taking the Provera, and she was only on the estrogen. And again, this is not a bioidentical estrogen. This is, not, again, our first choice. But when they looked at that, they said the women only taking estrogen, which was thought to be the big risk, had a 20 to 27% reduction in breast cancer. So taking estrogen by itself didn't increase it. It looked like it was actually protective in some ways. There was also reductions in heart disease and all-cause mortality. So it seemed that when you took out the progestin, this cancer risk, pretty much disappeared. Now this is a mouse study, but this one was a very interesting one that was showing reflecting some of the same information. So what they do with this is they take mice, they implant breast cancer, and then they test different things on the cancer. This is the same method they use when they're developing new drugs. They'll test it in this way and then see if it's promising to take it to the next stage. So they're using the same model that they would use for new drug development. But in this case, they took the mice, grew the breast cancer, then divided them into 8 different groups. And they tested all kinds of combinations. One was the aromatase inhibitors, the estrogen blockers, which is a standard treatment for breast cancer. But they also tested the hormones, estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone, in different kinds of combinations. And the results were really interesting. So when they showed taking either placebo, taking nothing, or taking low doses of estradiol and progesterone, that had the fastest growth of the breast cancer. It was about equal. It wasn't any difference if they used a placebo or added some low-dose estradiol. It just didn't help it in any way. Then they did the aromatase inhibitor, and that reduced the growth a certain amount. And then they used high-dose estradiol and progesterone by itself, and it reduced the growth the same amount as blocking the hormones. Then they put the two together. They gave the aromatase inhibitor and the estradiol and progesterone, and it was exactly the same. It reduced it exactly the same amount. And it was a modest amount. Then they did estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone And when they put all three together, this had the most dramatic reduction in the growth of breast cancer. So it seems when you're putting in the natural hormones in the proper percentages or proper combinations, it doesn't promote the cancer. It seems to actually be fairly good at inhibiting it. Interestingly, the other thing they looked at in the study was other issues with the treatment. One of them is when you look at aromatase inhibitors, when you're getting rid of the estrogens, you're getting a lot of estrogen deficiency problems, including problems with your lipids, with your bone metabolism, their memory. Somehow they measured all this in the mice. But when they were using the hormones, you didn't have any of these negative effects. Now, you would think with this information that that you're getting no side effects, you're getting maybe an increased response. Maybe you should look into this more. I don't expect that this is ever going to come to a clinical trial because there's too much fear around hormones cause cancer. That's the bottom line. But this is a direction that really needs to be looked at more, because our assumptions about it seem to be less than perfect. Here's another study that was looking at the effects of the part we're looking at, the effects of the vitamin treatments on gastric cancer. So they had a large group here, and it was actually done as a prospective trial. So they had one group on the control group, and the other group, they put them on what they called vitamin treatment. Vitamin treatment for them just meant vitamin C, E, and selenium. But even with that, even with those three vitamins, again, they reduced in half the deaths from gastric and esophageal cancer. So it can take not so much to get some pretty powerful effects. This was a small study, but it was actually very impressive. This is a study of patients with lung cancer. And they had the standard treatments. They had the standard chemotherapy, radiation. But then they added a high-dose vitamin mineral supplement. And when I went in to look at the paper to see exactly what they were giving, actually giving really substantial doses of pretty much all of the vitamins, minerals, fatty acids. It was a really comprehensive supplement treatment. Now, with this cancer, the expected survival at 30 months is 1%. So you have, and what they found here is 40% of them were still alive at 6 years, which is pretty dramatic. And the results were, if they narrowed it down farther, the earlier they started the supplements, the better their chance of being in that group. Now, this was another one, a later study, also looking with a different form of lung cancer. Again, using the standard treatment or adding some antioxidants to the treatment. Now, in this one, their treatment wasn't a multiple high-dose combination of things. They were using vitamin C, vitamin E, and beta-carotene. And when they did that, they found that the survival at 1 year with chemotherapy alone was about 33%. And if they had added the antioxidants, it got up to about 39%. Also, it's interesting, in the chemotherapy group, there were no complete remissions at all, but there were 2 patients who had complete remissions when they added the vitamins. So here we're seeing that we're still seeing some improvement in the survival when we added some vitamins, but in this case, they added a little bit, and they got a little bit of benefit. This was another, rat study, but this was just to illustrate the importance of synergy. So here they took a bunch of rats, they gave them a carcinogen, a really good one. They gave them 100% of them got cancer from it. And then they added 4 different nutrients and various combinations. They did them by themselves. They did them 2 at a time, 3 at a time, 4 at a time, and they looked at the chances of developing cancer from this carcinogen. So one nutrient alone reduced it in half. If they put 2 together, they reduced it 70%. 3 together, 80%. And if they gave all 4 of them, they were preventing it in most of them. This is another, example of the synergism. It's a laboratory study, but here they showed that both vitamin C and vitamin K3 have anti-cancer activity on breast cancer. But if they gave the 2 of them together, they got the effect at 10 to 50 times lower doses. So by combining, you can really magnify the effectiveness. And then, of course, we get these kind of studies. By the way, all these other studies that I've been showing about the benefits of the nutrients, if I speak to oncologists, they're not familiar with any of them. They're all familiar with this one. They all know this particular study, called The Effect of Vitamin E and Beta-Carotene on the Incidence of Lung Cancer and Other Cancers in Male Smokers. So here they had a group of male smokers, and they put them into different groups of a placebo, or they added vitamin E alpha-tocopherol, and even that was alpha-tocopherol acetate, a synthetic form of it, or they added beta-carotene. And the results were is that the ones taking the beta-carotene, the vitamin E didn't seem to make any difference at all, but taking the beta-carotene, they said there was an 18% increase in lung cancer. So they took an antioxidant and they increased the risk of the lung cancer. So, of course, antioxidants cause lung cancer. But if we look back at some other studies before that, they had over 200 epidemiological studies showing fruits, vegetables, high antioxidant foods were lowering cancer risk. There were 11 studies just on beta-carotene showing that it was protective against lung cancer. And then they did the study showing that it increased it. So what's happening with this? And what they think is going on with it is that, there's research showing that isolated antioxidants can become free radicals in a high free radical environment, which means the way an antioxidant works is that there's a free radical, the antioxidant comes along and neutralizes it. In the process, it becomes a free radical. And it can sometimes become a very aggressive one, more aggressive than the one it just neutralized. But what normally happens after that is the next antioxidant comes along and neutralizes that, and it gets passed down a chain until it's neutralized. Here, though, they were giving an antioxidant in isolation, only beta-carotene. So this was just happening one single and this was in an environment of smokers where they were flooded with free radicals. So you had this poor, soul, antioxidant trying to take care of all of this. And in the end, again, it looks like what they did was probably created a worse environment by doing that. So when you're doing these kind of studies, you need to be doing them with the teams, not with one component of them. The problem is they don't like doing studies that way. They like doing studies with one thing. Otherwise, they say, we don't know what was working. But the problem when you're using these kind of things, physiological, biochemical approaches, is that it's the teams that are working, not the individuals. This is another study in treating head and neck cancer patients, another one of these negative, if you want, antioxidant cancer studies. These are some of the ones that the oncologists are using to warn their patients, don't take any vitamins while we're doing our treatment because it's going to interfere. So it's based on these kind of studies. So in this one, they actually took a group of head and neck cancer patients. Again, they used only kind of low doses of synthetic beta-carotene or alpha-tocopherol acetate, or a placebo. And they were doing the standard radiation. And the results here is that the ones who were using the antioxidant had a 40% higher early recurrence rate, which they came back quicker. At 8 years, there was no difference, by the way, because it was just an early recurrence rate. The long term didn't seem to make much difference. But again, the result is that don't take antioxidants, it's going to interfere with the radiation, and you're going to get a recurrence faster. So that was the conclusion from it. The same group in the same journal published another paper a year later on the same study. So here, again, they sort of dissected the data further. And what they found is that this increase in recurrence only happened in patients who were continuing to smoke during their radiation treatments. So we have a very similar situation. Now we have a group of patients smoking a high free radical environment, taking a weak, isolated antioxidant. You know, if they weren't smoking, taking the antioxidants didn't have any negative effect on the recurrence rate. And even with that small amount, it's interesting, even that small amount of antioxidant, it still decreased some of the side effects of the radiation. There was less damage to the healthy tissue. So as long as you're not smoking, you can take antioxidants when you're doing it, and it'll only give you some benefits. But I said the message, though, that finally went out was, you know, it wasn't don't smoke during radiation, it was don't take vitamins. This is some other laboratory stuff, again, just showing the importance of synergy. This is Prasad is a well-known researcher in using different nutrients on cancer. And again, he also had the same conclusion that if you're using one antioxidant at low doses, that's not going to help. So when they used a mixture of vitamin A, vitamin E succinate, vitamin C, and carotenoids. Oh, by the way, the same researcher, when he was looking at vitamin E, he found that there was a big difference whether you're using vitamin E succinate or vitamin E acetate. The acetate is the common synthetic one that's being used, and it was actually the one being used in the studies. But vitamin E succinate had some good anti-cancer effects, whereas the acetate didn't. So even the antioxidant they used in the study was the form that was least likely to have any benefit. And this work was done before the other study was done, so this information was out there. So in this particular one, when they used the combination of these four things, it reduced the proliferation of melanoma cells in culture by about 50%. Okay, so we're reducing the growth with these four. Then they just increased the vitamin C. They doubled the amount of vitamin C in the same mixture, and that reduced it by about 90%. So again, using combinations, using them in good doses, makes a big difference. This is another one done by the same researcher. Here he showed vitamin A and beta-carotene at high doses administered before radiation and during the treatment period had a 90% cure rate. When they did the radiation with vitamin A and beta-carotene, they had a 90% cure rate. The radiation by itself didn't have any cure rate. So it seems that the antioxidants are not interfering. These are some review papers, just looking at the same issue. Do antioxidants interfere with the traditional treatments? So here, antioxidants, this is their title of their paper, antioxidants and other nutrients do not interfere with chemotherapy or radiation therapy and can kill and increase survival. Kill of the cancer, not the patient. And here they looked at a large number of patients, 280, 50 human clinical trials. They were all different. They're all using different combinations of stuff. But still the conclusion is that adding the nutrients in general increased the killing effect of the standard therapies and decreased the side effects. It protected the healthy tissues. We had a similar one that was done a little bit later by Keith Block. He was a little more rigid in his criteria, so he only took 19 clinical trials, but pretty much the same conclusion. There was none of them showed any issue in terms of reducing the effectiveness of the standard treatments when they're adding the nutrients. And again, if anything, showed increased response and less toxicity. And these are just some more individual studies. These are using glutathione for protecting nerve damage from platinum-type therapies. The platinum drugs are notorious for causing nerve damage. But they found in this particular study, if they added glutathione, they reduced the neuropathy from 42% to 27%. This is another similar one using vitamin E this time to protect against neuropathy from the platinum drugs. This time they reduced the toxicity from 85% to 31%. And these are some published case studies. In this one, they were looking at these are two advanced ovarian cancer patients. They had standard chemotherapy. They got the standard treatment, but they were also taking high-dose oral antioxidants and getting intravenous vitamin C twice a week. In these two particular cases, 3 years later, they were showing no evidence of disease, which is fairly unusual for ovarian cancer. This is another one showing some case reports. In this case, there were 3 cases of cancer treated with intravenous vitamin C and supplements. This time, these particular patients declined chemotherapy, so they were only doing the nutrients. And again, in all 3 cases, they were showing unexpectedly long survival times. One of them looked like he was actually cured. And these are published cases because they were very, rigidly looked at. There was very detailed descriptions of the process. In this particular one, the breast cancer patients, 125 breast cancer patients, all of them again getting the standard care here. And 53 received intravenous vitamin C for at least a month. And the results were that with the intravenous vitamin C, it resulted in significant reductions in symptoms of nausea, loss of appetite, fatigue, depression, sleep disorders, hemorrhagic diastasis. All the side effects that you would get from chemotherapy were pretty dramatically reduced by adding the intravenous vitamin C. And of course, we have to get these studies. Now, after all these good things about vitamin C, so we get a study here. This is a laboratory study. These aren't done in real patients. The laboratory study, the title of the study is Vitamin C Antagonizes the Cytotoxic Effects of Anti-Neoplastic Drugs. So here they gave what they call dihydroascorbate. Again, it's in the laboratory, in combination with different chemotherapy drugs, and they said when they gave the dihydroascorbate, it reduced the cytotoxicity of the cancer cells in all of the drugs they tested. So again, here we have a well-publicized study, saying that vitamin C is going to interfere with chemotherapy. Now, you might think that if you have a study that's with the title of Vitamin C Antagonizes, you may think that they were using vitamin C. It's not exactly true. What they were using was oxidized vitamin C. Oxidized vitamin C is not what we use on people, it's what we throw away. But this is what they used when they were testing in their study. Now, fortunately, the Europeans came along a few years later, and they repeated the study, but they repeated it in more different groups. And here, their conclusion was ascorbate exerts anti-proliferative effects through cell cycle inhibition, sensitizes tumor cells towards cytostatic drugs. So when they did their study, they did a lot more groups here. Here they used ascorbate, real vitamin C, by itself on the cancer cells, or they used the oxidized dihydroascorbate on the cancer cells. And they found that vitamin C by itself was inhibiting the growth, not the dihydroascorbate. And then they combined it with various chemotherapy drugs. And their conclusion there was that when they combined them, it either had no effect on the chemotherapy, or it enhanced the effect on the chemotherapy on the cancer cells. So when you're using real vitamin C, again, we don't see that there's any interference. but we see that it may be actually improving the effectiveness of the chemotherapy. Again, the first study everybody knows about. The second study nobody knows about. And by the way, just like in terms of why this might be, just a little bit of theory. Vitamin C in high doses, we're using it almost like a chemotherapy. And it's thought to work by creating a lot of hydrogen peroxide in the tumors. Now, the thing with cancer cells is most cancer cells are low in enzymes like catalase, which our normal cells have, which just immediately clear the hydrogen peroxide. So the idea is you can build up a lot of hydrogen peroxide, the cancer cell can't get rid of it, and hopefully it can build up to the point where it'll kill the cancer cell. Now, most of that takes place, outside of the cancer cells. So we're producing in the first study, when they used the dehydroascorbate, the reason that their excuse for using it was that regular vitamin C doesn't get into the cells very well, but the oxidized one does. So they said, well, let's use the stuff that gets into the cells really well, because then, we can test it better. But again, the benefits of vitamin C are mostly being created outside of the cell. So you're creating the peroxide outside, which then enters the cancer. So the whole principle of how they were trying to test vitamin C was in error, even from the theory of how it works. This one was actually looking at breast cancer and long-term survival. This was a meta-analysis of 10 studies. And here they were using mostly just a vitamin C supplement, just an oral supplement, or getting higher doses of vitamin C in their food. And the results were that if they took a supplement, just taking again, not necessarily a very high dose even, they could decrease the total deaths by 19%. If they increased the vitamin C as food sources, then they could decrease it by 27%. And again, that makes sense, because when you're getting the vitamin C in the food sources, you're getting the vitamin C with a few thousand other antioxidants working together with it. This one was actually a double-blind clinical trial with ovarian cancer patients. And here they were getting the standard chemotherapy, and they on top of that, either placebo or they got oral supplements plus intravenous vitamin C. Now the results were, I think, a little incomplete, but what they were showing in the animals, before they did the clinical trial, they actually did some animal studies. And the animal studies were showing that when you added the vitamin C in the supplements, that they improved the results of the chemotherapy and reduced the toxicity. When they did the clinical trial, they were only able to report on the reduction in toxicity. So that the women getting the chemo, they had dramatically less toxicity to liver, spleen, kidney, to all the organ damage was dramatically reduced. I think they were also showing a trend towards increased response of the tumor, but I don't think they had the statistic significance to be able to report it. This was just kind of an interesting slide that I stole from John Hoffer. John Hoffer teaches evidence-based medicine at McGill University. And this was just looking at how we maybe sometimes misuse what we call evidence-based medicine. You may remember this story that in New Zealand, there was a farmer who got the swine flu. He was severely ill with it. He was in a coma, expected to die. And the family, didn't like that. So they started doing what a lot of people do. They said, get on the internet and look for what they might find. So they found that intravenous vitamin C could help with viral infections. So they went to the hospital and said, can we give him some vitamin C? Their answer, of course, is, no, there's no evidence, there's no proof for this, maybe it's dangerous, we're not going to do it. The family went to court. They went to a judge, and the judge seemed rational. Said he's going to die, give him the vitamin C. So they did, and then he made a full recovery. Now, what was going on at the same time, though, there's a manual called the Guidelines for the Provision and Assessment of Nutrition Support Therapy in the Adult Critically Ill Patient. So there's two societies, the Society of Critical Care Medicine and the American Society for Parental and Enteral Nutrition, who put out this manual. And the manual is a manual of evidence-based treatments. And in their manual, it says, based on systemic review of studies, which included intravenous vitamin C of 1 gram every 8 hours, and other antioxidants, showed improved clinical outcomes of clinically ill patients. So in their manual, it says, give them vitamin C, based on the weight of the evidence. But their response was, there is no evidence, so we're not going to do it. So this becomes a way of just being able to dismiss treatments that you're not familiar with, rather than it actually not being evidence-based. John Hoffer then did this clinical trial where with high-dose intravenous vitamin C in patients with advanced cancer. So this was a group of patients who had multi-drug resistant advanced cancer, so they've had their chemo, it wasn't working anymore. It was determined that it wasn't going to work. There was no more chemo that they thought was worth giving. So they took these patients and they gave them one of the chemos that they thought would have worked if they were still sensitive, and along with intravenous vitamin C. So the results showed that half the patients, it didn't seem to make much difference, but the other half showed either some stable disease for a short time or even for a longer period of time. And there was no signs of any toxicity by giving the high doses of vitamin C. So you were getting some benefit. These were not dramatic cures, but it was showing that there was some benefit by giving intravenous vitamin C even in these very resistant terminal patients. The conclusion from the paper that they wrote was again just more of a comment on the state of oncology now, is the present state of chemotherapy is unsatisfactory. New cancer drugs continue to be developed and approved on the basis of marginal improvements in survival at an unsustainably high financial cost. So you're getting a lot of these new biologic targeted therapies, really expensive, that have little benefit, if any, and if that, usually for a short time. So it would seem more rational for cancer investigators to attempt to improve the effectiveness of well-known, inexpensive, generic cancer therapies by studying their clinical interaction with antioxidants, especially vitamin C. Despite its biological and clinical plausibility, it is ignored by conventional cancer investigators and funding agencies. So you're getting his frustration there. That we have something that can make a difference, but no one's interested. Okay, now we're going to go on to one of the newer approaches now, which if you were at some of the other cancer lectures, you might have seen some of the talk around the metabolic treatments for cancer. So we're going to look at some of the newer approaches right now. This was a nice paper called Tumors, Wounds That Do Not Heal, Similarities Between Tumor Stroma Generation and Wound Healing. So here they're finding that when you have a wound, the mechanisms that our body uses to heal the wound are pretty much the same mechanisms that the cancer cells are using to grow. So they create inflammation, growth factors, enzymes, angiogenic chemicals. These are all the things that we need to repair damage. In the cancer, though, there's no off switch, so that with normal healing, you release all these chemicals, you do the repair, and then it shuts off. The cancer cells don't shut off, they just keep going. But what this is showing is that we don't really have cancer genes. we're not born with genes that are going to give us cancer. We're born with repair genes that are being inappropriately used by cancer cells. And when we're looking at cancer growth, there's a lot of things in the terrain, in the environment, that will affect cancer. This includes increased oxidation, especially free radicals, inflammation, immune system failure, glycemia, blood sugar, high insulin, high stress hormones, which seem to work more through suppressing the immune system and inflammation. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So here we have, we have some examples here of how various natural substances are working against cancer. We actually have a fair bit of information. And what you're seeing here are different substances and the effects they have on gene products or even gene expression. This is kind of like what they're trying to do with the new targeted therapies. They're going after specific targets. We have a lot of natural substances. This is actually just a small, percentage of the numbers that have been looked at that have targeted therapies. And maybe, again, what's more important here is that they have things here like EGCG, green tea extracts, lycopene, genistein, curcumin, resveratrol, omega-3 fats, all these different things that have identified targets, anti-cancer targets. Again, what's important, though, is you'll see that for any particular target, most of the time you have a number of different things acting on it. And the same substance is acting very often on multiple different targets. So, again, maybe the message here is that if we're using combinations of them, and not even so many, your combinations of several different things, you can target multiple, areas in the cancer and probably get synergistic activity that you can magnify the effectiveness. Okay, so with our metabolic theory, a lot of this started becoming more prominent after they had what they called the end of genome project, end of cancer. So they started a project in 2006 where we had the technology now where you can take a cancer cell, map out all the genes in it fairly quickly, and they decided that they're going to do this with 10,000 different kinds of tumors. And they discovered about 10 million cancer-related mutations. And their idea is that they're going to identify which mutations are connected to which kind of cancer, and then they're going to design their drugs to go after these mutations, and they're going to be done with cancer. This is going to be the end of cancer. That was at the start of the project. This was the excitement and the enthusiasm. They were even talking about, and all this barbaric treatment we're doing with chemotherapy, that's going to be a thing of the history. So in 2015, they published the results that they had, and they basically said that we can't find any pattern for anything. We can't find any mutations that are consistently connected with any particular cancer. Maybe even worse for the theory is that they had cancer, these are like cancer cells, that they could find none of the mutations in, but they were still behaving as cancer. And then on top of that, they're finding, cancers are often quick to become resistant, typically activating different genes to bypass whatever cellular process is blocked by the treatment. So we find a targeted therapy, we find that, the cell has this, we can block it, and it works for a short time. And then the cell just bypasses it. So then we're going back to Otto Warburg. He actually was publishing some of his work back in the beginning of the 1930s. And Warburg, came to the conclusion that cancer, if you saw some of the other lectures, talks about it, where they're saying that, at the time he found in the 1930s that cancer, pretty much every cancer cell that he looked at had a particular metabolism that he was calling anaerobic glycolysis. So normal cells will take sugar, combine it with lots of oxygen, and produce efficient energy that way. So the cancer wasn't doing that. We're giving it the glucose, and it wasn't using much oxygen, and it wasn't getting much energy from a molecule of glucose. It wasn't a very efficient way to get energy, but that's what it was doing. And his conclusion was that, why would a cell go to an inefficient method if it had a good one? So he said, well, it must be because there was damage to the normal respiration. So it would fall back on its second choice. And what they found is that, the cancer cells, continued to operate this way regardless of whether there was plenty of oxygen around. And this he called the metabolic signature of cancer. That if cells were doing this, that almost defined them as cancer. Seafried, took this a lot farther. They dissected the mechanisms much more, saying that emerging evidence indicates that impaired cellular energy metabolism is the defining characteristic of nearly all cancers, regardless of cell origin. The general hypothesis that genomic instability and essentially all hallmarks of cancer, including aerobic glycolysis, the Warburg effect, can be linked to impaired mitochondrial function and energy metabolism. This, again, if you would have seen this in some of the other talks, some of the other cancer talks, but it was a very simple, clear experiment. So here they took the nucleus from a cancer cell, presumably with all the cancer mutations in it, put it into the cytoplasm of a normal cell, and what happened was what they called extinguishes the tumorigenic phenotype, which means it was behaving as a normal cell. It wasn't acting like a cancer cell, in spite of all the mutated genes. Another group at a different center repeated basically the same study. They tried to do it even more carefully, just to make sure there were no other confounding factors to confuse the picture, but they had got the same result. And then they did the opposite. They took a normal nucleus with no cancer genes, healthy DNA, and put it into the cytoplasm of a cancer cell. And then most often it behaved as a cancer cell. So here it seemed to be clear that what was determining whether it was going to be cancer or not had little to do with what was going on in the DNA. It had to do with something else. And again, the main culprit seems to be the mitochondria. Just one more paper just trying to explain what they call retrograde regulation due to mitochondrial dysfunction. So when mitochondria are damaged, they actually send signals, to the nucleus to activate different genes. Largely to try to repair. This is part of the repair mechanism. But the genes that are activating, again, are the ones that affect metabolism, proliferation, tumor progression, metastasis, resistance, apoptosis. So all of the qualities of cancer are being activated by signals from damaged mitochondria. This was kind of another interesting paper where they were talking about two of the developing theories of cancer, one being the metabolic theory, and the other the cancer stem cell theory. And what this paper was saying is that, well, maybe we don't have two theories. We may just be looking at the same theory from different perspectives. Because what they're seeing is that when a cell is damaged, it becomes less differentiated. It actually starts to look more like a stem cell. So it becomes, so that the damage to the mitochondria itself, which then triggers this regression, if you want, this changes in the cell, may be what's turning it, if you want, into the cancer stem cell. So we may not have two different things going on, two different theories. This might just be the same theory, and we're just looking at it from different angles. So if we take this theory, now we can look at, so what can we do with it? So how can we use the fact that cancer uses a different metabolism in the treatment of the cancer? So one of the ways to do it is to look at the amount of carbohydrate that we're giving. So most malignant cells depend on steady glucose availability for their energy and biomass generating demands and are not able to metabolize significant amounts of fatty acids or ketone bodies, which are metabolized in the mitochondria, so they can't use those very well. So the cancer cells are very dependent on regular glucose. Also, when you're having when you're looking at glucose metabolism, you're also getting what you might call insulin resistance. So high glucose levels are also going to produce high insulin and IGF-1. And these are both hormones that will stimulate the growth of the cancer. So the glucose feeds the cancer, and the hormones that are being triggered by it help to promote the cancer growth even further. They also found that the ketone bodies themselves, which are produced when you have low carbohydrate diet, it's not just the fact that you have low carbohydrates, the ketones themselves that are being produced have some inhibiting effect on the cancer. So when you're on a low carbohydrate diet, preferably down to a real ketogenic diet, you're depriving the cancer of a food supply, you're reducing the hormones that are stimulating the cancer, and you're producing ketones that may be additionally inhibiting it. Now, because cancer is primarily using glycolysis, not the mitochondria for their energy, you have different enzymes that the cancer is dependent on for their energy source that our normal cells don't have to use much. And there are a number of substances that can interfere with that. So one of the early ones that was being looked at was dichloroacetate, DCA. This was largely checked at a university in Canada. And they found that the DCA blocked one of the important glycolysis enzymes. And it was actually interfering with glycolysis and actually even pushing pyruvate into the mitochondria. And they thought that there may be two different ways that this was having benefit. One was that, again, it was interfering with the ability of the cancer to get energy, but it may also have been reactivating some of the mitochondria, actually having what they call the reversal of the Warburg effect. But the mitochondria are also largely responsible for apoptosis, for normal cell death. So one of the reasons that cancer cells may be living forever is because the damaged mitochondria are no longer giving the signal for the cancer cell to die. But if you can reactivate it, you may be able to turn on the death mechanism again in the cancer cell. So they were thinking that you may have been having both effects with this. So they took this, they did laboratory studies, animal studies, and they went to even small clinical trials showing benefits when they were adding DCA. And there was not much toxicity with it. There was a little bit in high doses, but it was not much. And after it got to that point, the research stopped because there was no more funding. Another one that we have is bromopyruvate, again, which has been in the news a fair bit, especially a few years back. Another molecule that was found to inhibit, at that point they were mostly looking at an enzyme called hexokinase 2. This is one of the very important glycolysis enzymes, and they found in general in cancer cells these were markedly increased. So the cancer cells were driving up this enzyme because it needed it, to generate its energy. And they found that bromopyruvate was a good inhibitor of this. It probably had, when they looked at it further, it looked like it was having effects in other places too. But the bottom line is that it was an inhibitor of glycolysis. So they studied this in animals. They had 19 rodents with cancers. The bromopyruvate cured 100% of them. They had a case study with a teenage boy with terminal liver cancer, at which point 95% of his liver was cancer. And they put the bromopyruvate directly into the liver, and it seemed to clear the cancer in the liver. So, of course, this was looking promising, and they wanted to go ahead to further studies, of which there was no more funding. Another one that looks very good right now, too, is another thing called methylglyoxal. Methylglyoxal is an interesting substance that you find naturally in manuka honey. So this New Zealand honey that they found was really good for treating wound infections. The active ingredient seemed to be methylglyoxal. So they looked at methylglyoxal, and it also was an inhibitor of an enzyme in glycolysis called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, one of the important, again, glycolysis enzymes, and also was inhibiting in the mitochondria what they call complex 1. So it was working in glycolysis and in the mitochondria. Interesting, it had no effect on healthy mitochondria. So it was only inhibiting the complex 1 in cancer cells. And then this went as far as to animal studies. It went to a human clinical trial, what they called a 3-phase study of cancer patients. Here there were a lot of patients. There was, I think it might have been 80 patients or so, mostly with advanced cancers, that they put on a protocol of methylglyoxal. They reported 40% of them went into remission. They said 40% of them had regression of the cancer, and 20% of them they didn't see any benefit, but they still felt better anyways. So this is also looking very promising. Hopefully we'll be seeing it go farther from here. Melatonin, another one that's been looked at in cancer treatment. A more recent paper, though, interesting enough, just in 2016, was looking at, aside from some other effects of melatonin, it was also inhibiting glycolysis. So it was also working on the metabolism of the cancer cell. It's doing other things too, and when they looked at clinical trials done with melatonin, a meta-analysis of solid tumors, they found that melatonin doubled complete and partial remissions, reduced dramatically the side effects of the standard therapies. Now, this is actually an important study. This is where a group in France, there was a group there that's been researching this for quite a while now, looking at the metabolic treatment of cancer. And initially they said they identified 27 compounds known to affect glycolysis. They reduced it to 7 that they thought were more effective. They started using them 2 at a time. And then when they found a pair that was good, they ran a clinical trial. And here they took 40 patients with terminal cancers. So these were people that were given 2 to 6 months to live. And these were the ones that they decided they're going to take a couple of supplements and treat them with it. The 2 that they found was alpha-lipoic acid and hydroxycitrate. They also added LDN as part of the protocol to see if they get it to work better. But again, the alpha-lipoic acid, hydroxycitrate are 2 substances that were blocking different enzymes in glycolysis, and together they looked pretty powerful. And the results is that they published results after a year, at which point they didn't expect anyone to be alive. But instead, they had 60% of them alive if they were only doing the supplements, 70% alive if they combined it with some other chemotherapy. So 70% is pretty good compared to 0. There's some new treatments that I think are going to be up and coming soon. One of them called gallium maltolate, which is working in a different way. We also find that cancer doesn't just need a lot of glucose, it also needs a lot of iron. And gallium to cancer cells looks like iron, and it can take it up in place and disrupt that whole iron metabolism. And it probably, like a lot of things, is having other metabolic effects too, even aside from the iron. Fluorescein, another good one. You'll find in fairly high concentration in apple skins and roots. Fluorescein is working on a different angle. It's blocking what they call the glucose transporters. So in the cell membranes, we have transporters to pull glucose into the cells. Of course, cancer cells have huge amounts of them because they want a lot of glucose. And this is a substance that can block the ability of the cancers to take in the glucose. So we have other things to interfere with the metabolism. We have this one to try to actually interfere with it getting in the first place. Another one that's getting some attention is salicinium, which is a sugar complex with another molecule. Found that it also could be interfering with glycolysis and maybe actually improving immune system surveillance. Okay, these are just going through different supplements to affect different qualities of cancer. In the end, though, if we're looking at, these things all have to be customized, but if we're looking at some of the basic principles and what we want to do when we're designing a plan, we want to, for sure get good amounts of the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin K2, vitamin E, especially with the tocotrienols. These are all important anti-cancer substances that we want to make sure they are well loaded with. Also, even concerned with toxicity, you don't tend to get much toxicity with these fat-soluble vitamins in spite of the fact that they're stored in the body and theoretically can become toxic. But when you're using them in balance, that doesn't seem to happen, even at high doses. We want to get the minerals in there, especially things like magnesium, zinc, selenium, the omega-3s. Other food extracts, like we saw it in that complicated slide, things like curcumin, green tea, resveratrol, sulforaphane. These are very important anti-cancer substances that have multiple targets. So we want to get those into the program. We have certain foods that will be high in some of these nutrients. Nuts and seeds will have the minerals. Broccoli sprouts are one of the best ones for sulforaphane. Seaweed, you'll get your iodine. Mushrooms have other good immune system effects. And then also the metabolic side, the ketogenic diet. So in the metabolic side of things, we want the ketogenic diet. There's indications that if we add hyperbaric oxygen, we can magnify the benefits of that. And then, like in this clinical trial, alpha-lipoic acid, hydroxycitrate, some of these metabolic blockers, and other potentials, DCA, bromopyruvate, methylglyoxal, melatonin, all of these other targeted metabolic blockers, which again have really no toxicity to healthy cells. These are safe things to use, but can have powerful effects against cancer. Creatine is another, there's this thing that athletes use a lot of times to improve energy, but it also seems to be affecting the cancer metabolism. And it may even be worth adding a ketone supplement itself to raise ketones even more for the benefit, the anti-cancer effect of the ketones themselves, again, in addition to the low carbs. So what we want to do is, modify, correct as many of the cancer-promoting factors as possible, impair the underlying cancer metabolism. We want to use these synergistically, so the more mechanisms that we can affect at the same time, usually the better the response is going to be. We want to use teams, in which case a lot of times we can use lower doses to get the same effect. And then we want to protect the healthy cells from damage. And just a final case report. This is a 3-year-old girl diagnosed with high-risk neuroblastoma, what they call MYC amplified, which is bad, in 2007. And this kind of picture usually is considered a dismal prognosis. The MIBG scan, which is a special scan, like a PET scan that they use for this disease, was showing bone marrow, lymph node involvement from head to feet. And even the rare children who had some long-term survival from this disease, they almost all had significant organ damage from the treatments, including hearing loss, heart damage, other neurologic damage. And if they managed to survive their first cancer, they also had a high risk of developing a secondary cancer from the original treatments, such as lymphomas. So she was started on the standard, very aggressive chemotherapy. At the same time, she was started on intravenous vitamin C and multiple high-dose supplements similar to the ones I was just showing. After 3 months, they did a repeat MIBG, which showed complete resolution of the tumors. So it was clear at that point. She continued the vitamin C for another year and continued oral supplements since then. So now 11 years later, she's living normally, no heart damage, no hearing damage. This was actually the one that got me into the field. This one was my daughter. But I think you'll find a lot of doctors who are getting into integrative cancer, they're doing it because it was personal. And they want to, what they learn from it, they want to be able to pass on to others. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Mel Litman. Thank you so much. You can tell he's just a fount of information, and if you want to ask him questions, I'm sure he'll be around. And right now we're going to take a break, and we will see you at the next session. Thank you once again.